If you were to create your ideal day, what time would you get up of a morning? Any thoughts? 10? 10. If this is your ideal day, wouldn't you have missed some of your... And I promised not to pick on you too, Lynn, didn't I? Right? Alwyn, what time would you get up for your ideal day? 10 o'clock. Half your day's gone. This is this amazing day you've imagined, and it's your ideal. And at 10 o'clock, at the beginning of the day, right? But see, if it's your ideal day and you've planned it in advance, you would have a purpose for it, wouldn't you? And your purpose would give you the motivation to even get up before 10 o'clock. Right? Or 4:30 in the morning, and even catch a train. That's true. If your ideal day involved a special trip somewhere, you would get up earlier, wouldn't you? A trip to the snow, whatever. Right. 2 weeks ago, we celebrated 5 years since Redgum began. We're not a baby church anymore. We are growing up. And 2 weeks ago, I read out what I believe is a prophetic declaration over us and over Redgum, and it's out of 1 Peter, and I want to read it to you. It's in chapter 2, and it's verse 10, and it says, "Once you were not a people, but now you are a people. Once you had not received mercy, but now we have received mercy." See, people are formed by God on purpose, for purpose. Now, at one time, just a sec. At one time, I was the president of the East Gippsland Rabbit Breeders Association. Commercial rabbit breeders. And when we gathered, all the commercial rabbit breeders in this area had one thing in common. Our arms were all scarred up from picking up rabbits and weighing them and getting scratched. And when we shifted to Sydney, I became the president of the Macarthur branch of the Koi Association of Australia, Koi Fish. And we showed fish and we judged fish and we bred fish. And so if you want to know anything about meat rabbits or koi fish, I'm your boy, right? But this is what I've noticed, is that humans, when we gather for a purpose. And God's kids are no different, except that the purpose behind why we gather is so much higher, so much more noble, so much more richer. It's life-giving when we gather. It's where mercy is given and mercy is received. And mercy is this active compassion. And it's more than just a beautiful thing. And it's more than just something that feels good. In my Rabbit Breeders East Gippsland Association, you think that's funny, don't you, right? You belong to all sorts of other organisations, so don't you get smart with me, girl, right? Yes, sir.
Is that why you rabbit on along?
Why rabbit on along?
That was cheeky.
Now, am I allowed to shift my picking on to... Can I? Yeah? Yes. Yes. You just wait. Right. But in that rabbit group or in that koi fish group, I found really good people and they became really good friends, but I never experienced in those organisations, in those groups, God's grace. Because you can't pass on to someone what you haven't personally experienced when it comes to grace. And it's what makes the difference between our unique gathering of God's people and any other gathering of humans on planet Earth. And grace has this incredible power to transform lives like nothing else can. You cannot live your ideal day every day. John Denver tells us that. I have a little bit of a song that John Denver sung. Can we play that, thanks?
Sometimes the hard times won't leave me.
That brought back some memories for some of you. There's a weird book in the Bible. It's called Ecclesiastes. It's a strange book with a strange title, and that title comes from a Hebrew word that's translated into a Greek word. It just means preacher. But in Ecclesiastes, Solomon writes about the meaninglessness of life without God. In fact, he calls it a chasing of the wind. And in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, he writes these words. You may have heard them. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun, under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to, and I want to declare over Redgum, over us as a people today, that there is a season that we're coming into. It's a time. And in Solomon's words, it's a time to heal, to mend, to build, to plant, to laugh, to dance, to speak, and to love. There's a purpose in gathering that's so much bigger than us. And in 2 Peter, he sends this email to us, to God's people. And he makes a statement in chapter 1 of 2 Peter, and it's verse 5. He makes this statement. For this very reason. Now, I like reasons. If I'm not motivated to do something, I won't do it. And in a general sense, I only do what I want to do. And before you get too smug with me and feel so much superior than me, we are no different, you and I. See, we may use different language, Nick. You may say, I've got to go to work at the hospital today, right? You may say those words. We may say things like, I've got to pick up the kids. I've got to cook tea. No, you don't have to go to work. Nobody's got a gun next to your head and going, Nick, if you don't go to work, right? Merrin has the gun, sorry, yes. You got the key to the safe. It's a good thing to do, right? But everything we do is a choice. And behind that choice is a reason. There's a motivation. And if we're going to do something we don't like doing, there is a bigger purpose behind it. Now, when Peter wrote this second book, he had three main reasons for writing it. One was to stimulate our growth as Christians. One is to combat bad theology, like false teaching. And the third was to encourage us to watch out for the return of Jesus. And I think those three things still hold today. I have an expectation that Jesus will return in the lifetime of my grandkids. I don't know that that's true, but we're going to actually, in the weeks ahead, we're going to have a look at some of that stuff. But in this opening chapter of 2 Peter, he jumps right into what he wants us to experience, not just for an ideal day, but for an ideal life. And he describes it as grace and peace in abundance. And whenever you see those two words, grace and peace, connected together in the New Testament, anywhere, grace always comes first. And there's a reason. Because peace flows out of the work of grace. It all starts with grace. Charlie, you love the word grace, don't you? It's like your little favourite. And I thought when I was getting this ready, Charlie's going to love this, Charlie. So I'm preaching to you, Charlie. We're agreeing together, okay? Now, if peace is the absence of fear and worry, if peace is freedom from anxiety, you and I probably know someone in our world that could do with a big dose of peace. Coral's grandmother was a beautiful lady. But whenever I think of her grandmother, I always think of someone who was very anxious and very worried. And they lived up at Wollgoomerang, up in the mountains, and whenever they went somewhere in their Land Rover, there would be scratch marks on the passenger's door where she's hanging on. And she would do this when her husband Angus was driving. She'd go, Angus, Angus. She was just riddled with fear and anxiety on, the roads where just little narrow gravel and it just drops down to Never Never country, right? You know Carmen, don't you? Your backyard. Yeah. If peace flows out of grace, grace has got to be pretty good stuff. I don't need to describe to you what lack of grace looks like, because we've all experienced that in some way. It hurts. It's discouraging. You feel judged and criticised, and even if some of the things people say to you are true, it comes with a wrong spirit when grace is missing. And when the writer of Hebrews got to chapter 10, verse 25, he wrote this: "Do not neglect our meeting together." He's talking to Christians. Don't neglect meeting together. That is true. But over the years, Christians have used that as a stick against other Christians. But the writer of Hebrews didn't stop at that. He gave us a purpose, a reason. The motivation for coming together was to encourage one another. Encourage one another. Do you know, when you walked in the doors this morning, just you being here brought encouragement with you. You encouraged someone else today just by you being here. And when you walk in here, you position yourself to receive encouragement. See, the language of grace is encouragement. And Peter's a smart boy. When he writes this, he knows his time on earth is just about done. And he's writing to this very mixed group of Christians. They're Jewish Christians, they're Gentile Christians, different belief systems, values, backgrounds. And he writes what really is a simple, compelling picture of grace and peace, but then he adds one word to it. It's an ancient Greek word that he adds into just those picture of grace and peace. And it becomes the motivation, the reason for what he is about to give us as instructions of how to get this stuff. And I can't pronounce this Greek word, but it's amazing when you combine it with the word grace and peace. It means to have these things in increased and increasing measure, to have it made full, to have grace made full in your life, to experience it to a maximum capacity. What would it be like to live soaking in a bathtub of grace? Like overflowing, tap running, overflowing. What I find amazing about grace is that you can't pass it on until you've personally received it, experienced it. And Peter's about to show us how we can experience this abundant grace. And it flows in, it flows out. And in him helping us understand this, he places before us this cake called grace and peace, and he puts it in front of us. And in verse 2 of chapter 1, 2 Peter, he says this: grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God and of our Lord Jesus. And then we get to verse 5, and we discover this cake. It has 8 layers to it. And for some of you, you are about to understand, possibly for the first time in your life, why you have grown up in a Christian home and not experienced grace. Why it's possible for, tragically, a church to exist where grace is hard to find. And it has everything to do with one word. It's the word knowledge. See, knowledge is everything, but knowledge is not enough, and I'll explain that. Knowledge is everything, but knowledge is not enough. And the English word knowledge is used 5 times in the first 8 verses of chapter 1. But here's the thing. Peter uses 2 completely different Greek words that we translate into just one word. Now stay with me, right? Because when I saw this, it helped me understand how beautiful, beautiful Christians who love God, love His word, struggle with passing grace on. This is for me a way that I can understand, but it's not just to understand, it's also to see how we can receive grace, how we can experience this abundant, soaking bathtub grace. And when Peter begins and he drops this cake in front of us in verse 2, he says that it comes through the knowledge of God and Jesus. And it's contact knowledge. That's what the Greek word means, is contact knowledge. Please don't judge me for what I'm about to tell you, okay? I love dogs being in church. I'd love a church full of dogs. And cats, they stay at the door. But we can have a church full of cats. Dogs, sorry. I'm just picking up on what we're chatting about on Facebook, okay? God made dogs. He made cats for dogs to chase. So, focus. If Coral was in the room, she'd be saying, Lex, I just got back. Gee, I think the kids need you, Coral. Yes. You need to be in 2 places sometimes, Coral. So please don't judge me because our world has changed, but in our youth program here in Bairnsdale once, I had an idea. And I got this big electric fence unit. It could do 250 kilometres electric fencing, nearly 9,000 volts. And I had this idea that we would connect up the negative and the positive to 2 chairs. And we would sit a boyfriend and girlfriend in each chair and we would pretend to take a photo of them. And just before we're going to take the photo, the idea was that they would hold hands. You're ahead of me. All you electrical people, you know that suddenly joins a circuit up and suddenly, right? They remember that holding hands moment for a long time. Now, I have 2 granddaughters, and when Brooklyn was old enough to understand, I showed her that the electric fences on our place can hurt you. And she knows that because it's acquired knowledge I've taught her. And she's been able to pass that on to her little sister Remy and tell her, don't go near the fence will hurt you. But neither of them have experienced contact knowledge. I have experienced contact knowledge with electric fences many times. Contact knowledge you cannot pass on to someone, but acquired knowledge you can share and it can get passed on. And in verse 5, as Peter is about to give us this cake with 8 layers, he begins with the why we would want to even add layers to this cake. He says, for this very reason. What reason? To experience bathtub soaking grace. He says, for this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith, and here comes the layers, moral excellence, and to moral excellence, knowledge. But it's not the same word as the knowledge of Jesus. It's a completely different word. It's the Greek word gnosis. And it has to do with doctrine. The Strong's Concordance describes this word as a general knowledge of Christian religion. It's especially in the lawful things of what Christians should or should not do. It's about theology. And we need theology. We need understanding of our doctrine. We need to know what is a good thing for a Christian to do and what is not. But it's not the cake. It's a layer. And every layer has value. Every layer is important. But this is really down low in the cake. When you get higher up into the cake, when the cake is nearly completely full and made, we get to the layer of brotherly kindness and sacrificial love. That's when the grace flows. Not back down where you have knowledge that's just acquired. And then when he gets to verse 8, Peter ends up by saying this, for if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, these are the layers of the cake, they'll keep you from being ineffective and unproductive, not in your business, not in your work environment, but in your knowledge, contact knowledge of Jesus. That's the goal. When we as Christians only add to our faith moral excellence and acquired knowledge of doctrine and what we should do or shouldn't do, we will allow what happened during COVID to divide churches, to divide Christians over acquired knowledge, over what we think people should or shouldn't do. And that's not grace. Contact knowledge of Jesus releases this abundance of bath-soaking grace. And it's just, Charlie, can you imagine a bathtub full of grace just soaking in it? Oh. Imagine a people who once were not a people, but now have experienced mercy and can pass that on. See, as individuals, we're just so limited in what we can do, what we can achieve as individuals. I I've always been amazed how little I can achieve in a day or a week. It's frustrated me at times in my life, but I've come to realise that, as Peter explains to us, our weakness can release God's strength in our life, that we're made complete even in our weakness. And so I've realised that I can add to my life, I can extend my life by laughing at my weaknesses, by laughing at my mistakes. But I've also come to realise that if I laugh at Coral's weaknesses and Coral's mistakes, my life might get shortened. So the grace that we give us is what, if we can pass that on, that's the goal. And Peter in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when he's talking about his weaknesses, he says, I boast in my weakness. He says, because when I'm weak, I'm strong. But all of that begins in verse 9, when it begins as God talking, he says, my grace is sufficient for you. And that word, that the Greek word that Paul uses, it means to possess unfailing strength, to be strong, to be enough against any threat or danger. And get this, that grace is so powerful, we don't even have to pray that the threat or the danger go. How many times do we feel a threat and a danger and wanting God to remove it? We say, hey, my grace, my grace. That's the power of grace. And it comes before peace. If you want peace in a storm, it starts with grace. Coral's grandmother, if she had grown up, because she loved God, she was a Christian, if she had grown up in a church that had shown more grace, I don't think that the fear of those little mountain roads would have quite held the same power over her as it did. And even though as individuals we are so limited in our time and our energy and our finances, in God's kingdom on earth, 1 + 1 equals a whole lot more than 2. Last Sunday, Sarah came up to me after church. She said, Lex, I want to take on kids. I want to take on the kids ministry. And then someone else came to me afterwards and said, can I help? I've got experience with kids. I've done a lot of stuff for God with young kids. Can I help? And we're having a meeting this afternoon of where this can go, of what's possible. See, the world is changed by people who know we can't, but somehow we believe we can. And geographically, we've got East Bairnsdale just there, and we have Eastwood just there. Do you know there's 600 kids go to Lucknow Primary School in Eastwood. That's just one of 3 schools, primary schools in this community. Imagine what is possible. Every one of those kids come from a home that would welcome grace if it knocked on their door with no strings attached. When you stand in a line at the checkouts, all those people ahead of you, every one of them would love to experience grace. The person serving you, wherever you go, would love to know active compassion in their life. Just a thought, but why is it when I seem to stand in a checkout and there's 2 options, I choose the one that seems to go much slower after I stand in that one? The other one's just suddenly, I'm thinking, I should have gone over there. Now, I'm not saying that those people are longing to experience God, because they don't know who he is. See, when our culture, our community rejects the bride, they reject the bridegroom. They don't know who he is. And when Paul is trying to help us understand how God works with people who are far from him, he tells us in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, he says, "Don't you realise that it is God's kindness that is trying to lead you to him, to change the way you think?" That's the purpose of grace, to make us open and willing to see God differently. When we lived in Sydney, Mandy and Aaron began a youth ministry in a church plant, and the our youth ministry was amazing. They were having 100, 120 kids on a Friday night, and life change was happening in these kids. But for a whole series of reasons, Mandy and Aaron had to walk away from that youth ministry. And I can remember the grief that they were going through at the time, and Mandy, I remember her saying to me, "What will happen to the Tysons if we leave?" Tyson represented this, it was a kid from the Housing Commission area, very messed up kid. What will happen to the Tysons? And I said, God will look after the Tysons. Great bit of advice from Dad, God will look after the Tysons. Now, in this youth ministry, Mandy and Aaron had a team and they ran all this amazing event. I used to be the person with the microphone up the front with youth ministry. But then in this youth ministry that they are running, I get to go out and hang around in the dark as security. I'm no longer microphone Lex, I'm out in the dark where no one sees you, Lex, in case kids are doing naughty things. And after this youth ministry had finished, one day there was a knock on our door where we lived. And this kid standing there and he says, "I was playing in this area at the back of your house there and this model aeroplane went over your fence. Can I go get it?" And I looked at him and I said, aren't you Tyson? And he sort of looked at me and says, "Aren't you Mandy's dad?" She used to be my daughter, by the way, "Aren't you Mandy's dad?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Come in, get your aeroplane." And he saw these koi little fish that we're breeding and he started chatting about those. And then I started ministering to him about what had happened to the youth and why it closed down, because he didn't understand. And then we started ministering to Tyson. And over the next 3 years, we're in and out of each other's lives, over his family. And there were some nights I would find out that he was wanting to self-harm and I would knock on his house door at 1 o'clock in the morning and get his dad out of bed and say, "I think Tyson's hurt himself in the bedroom there." And he didn't have a door on his bedroom. He didn't have a bed. He had a mattress on the floor. There was a car engine beside the mattress. He didn't have a pillow. He didn't have sheets. There was a hole in his side, the wall of his bedroom, where he punched it and he had a drawing of himself being hung. And every time he'd come and we'd minister to him, he'd go home and he would self-harm. But when he was in our care, he was flourishing and we thought, what's going on? So we, as a church, we did up his bedroom. We painted it, we gyp-rocked it, we put a door, we got a bed, we gave him all that stuff. But he was still going downhill when he'd get home. So we decided as a church to pray through his house. And we put little bits of oil on the doors, and we prayed through and we went everywhere. And I remember someone in our church was really passionate about praying for spiritual things and against things that shouldn't be there. And they were going to do every little nook and cranny on that house. And there was a little sort of a door under the back veranda, and it's night time, and they stuck their head in there to pray over that bit. That's when the Staffordshire Bull Terrier stuck its nose in their face. That really spun them out. But something happened when we prayed over that house, prayed over that family. And one day, Tyson was staying with us, and about 11:30 that night, there was a knock on the doors of neighbours. They said, someone just stole your car. There's Tyson, he'd stolen our car. And they'd rung the police. The police didn't bother coming. But when I contacted Tyson, he said, I've taken your car, I'm sorry, but he said, I just want to kill myself in it. I contacted the police, and suddenly we had a chopper in the sky. We had 3 police units at our place, and all night they were chasing, trying to find him. They never found him. And the next morning, I went looking for him in a neighbouring suburb, Mount Annan. I found our car abandoned. It had been, he'd blown a tyre out, he'd backed it into a tree. There's graffitied on it. It was a bit of a mess. And then I tracked Tyson down. I found him at his gay boyfriend's house. And I put my arm around him. I said, Tyson, what's happened tonight doesn't change anything between you and I. But it does change some of the privileges that you had. Some of those are gone. You won't be staying in our place now. Won't be taking on learner driving help. And that day his dad came to me, he says, when I was growing up, if I'd had a church like your church, I wouldn't be where I am now. And a month or 2 later, his mum came to me and said, would you marry us? I said, what do you mean, marry you? You and Jason have been together for 20 years. You've raised 4 kids. Why do you want to get married? And she said to me, because I wanted to be married in the sight of God. And all the grace that a people had shown this family had brought that family to a place of being open to see God differently. And I said, I'd love to marry you. We're going to do it on a Sunday morning in church. And we're going to put on a morning tea for you. So we married them in our normal Sunday service. And we put on this big spread, and they invited all their friends and family. And I remember one of Tyson's uncles sitting at the back. He'd had a little bit to drink, and I remember preaching, and I heard him saying, this is boring. Can't wait to get down to the pub. That's the past. What are we going to do with today, the present? What can we do in this community? What is our purpose beyond just gathering to be nice to each other? What's our purpose? I want to drop a challenge out. If we had 10 people that would commit to a kids program as leaders to help us, if we had 10 people that would do the same with youth, with 20 people, you could change the kids and the youth culture of this town. You can. I've seen it happen before. But what would the rest of us do? We're not all called to kids ministry and youth ministry. What would we do? So here's the challenge. What if we were to find one person to show God's grace to, who's far from him, who doesn't know him, with no strings attached, not as a project, not as someone that you want to lead to Jesus. There's a place for being God's witnesses. There's an important place for speaking and sharing this. But this is not a person you're trying to win to Jesus. And if they don't respond, you shake the dust off and keep walking. No. And do you know why there'll be many of you won't do this? Or some of you won't do this? It's because the cost is too high. Not the benefits, not the joy that you could experience if this person came to Jesus, but the pain you live with if they don't. That's the cost. See, for some of you, you have families. You already ache and hurt over family members that are far from God and may never come to him, ever. And that's a tension to manage, not a problem to solve. It's not you can't save them. So why would you sign up to do it to someone else? When Jesus called us to go and make disciples, he didn't tell us how. But in Matthew 25, he assumed we would even take a cup of water and we would minister hot water, maybe with coffee and tea in it, milk, sugar. And we would do that to someone and we'd be doing it to him. No strings attached. I want to be a grace carrier to our world, and you do too. And the only way we can do that is to experience contact knowledge of Jesus and then let it flow through us. Your one already exists in your phone. You don't have to go looking for them. I have one. I have one. He doesn't know he's my one. He lives about 2 hours from here. He may never walk in this place. But he's my one that I'm sharing God's grace with. And when we're in Sydney, I had my one. And when we first got to know each other is in the Koi Fish Club. And he said to me, Lex, we can be best of mates, but don't you ever talk about God. That's him. Jerry, 10 years older than me. And for 8 years, I never ever talked about Jesus. And for 8 years, I was in his life, in and out. We bred koi fish together. We showed them together. We travelled together. And one day at a koi club meeting, in front of 40 other members, publicly, in front of all the blokes, he said, Lex, you know this religion of yours? How come you think that your way is the only way? He says, you've got 30 seconds. Now, you would have come up with a much better answer than me. I just said the difference between Christianity and every other religion on earth is that every other way is trying to somehow earn brownie points to be accepted, to find a place in Navarra, to be able to have peace with God. But I said, Christianity is God saying, you can't do that, so I'm going to do what you can't. And then I stopped. All the way home that day, he asked me question after question after question, and I only answered the question. I didn't unload 8 years of what I wanted to tell him. And then he never asked me another question. And during COVID, he died. Probably far from God. I don't know. He taught Sunday school as a kid. But his mother started coming to our church, and I picked her up each Sunday. There is a pain, a cost in sharing God's grace with no strings attached, because you can't control the outcome. But I believe it's what we can do. We have that capacity to somehow show God's grace, not just to other Christians, but to people far from God. Can I get the band up, thanks? Right. Judy, you're beautiful, right? And thank you for your encouragement, right? We are a royal priesthood. We are the apple of God's eye. We are his bride. Let's just shine. Let's just allow this beautiful, beautiful thing, we use a word to describe it called grace, and let that flow through us. But it starts with contact knowledge. Worship is a way we can enter that. And next week we're going to build a little bit more on how can we experience this contact knowledge of God. And I've got a special guest going to share some thoughts next Sunday. I'm going to keep that one up our little sleeve. But just during this next thing, while we sing this song, just ask yourself, God, who's my one? Who can I just show that extra bit of grace to? No strings attached, not as a project, but because they're God's creation.